Johnston, 1949 to 2008.
The question now rises upon final reading and adoption of HJR 3. Representative Read.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm humbled and awed to be standing before you today with the task of honoring Bryan Johnston on what would have been his 60th birthday, and I confess I'm a little worried about whether I'm up to the task. Before I get started, and in case I fall a little short, I'd like to call attention to the presence of a number of Bryan's colleagues from all of his roles, and particularly to a good portion of the five amigos known for their service together. Former Representative and current Lincoln County Commissioner Terry Thompson, former Representative, former Senator, and current member of the Employment Appeals Board, Tony Corcoran, and former Representative and current State Senator Floyd Przansky. Having said that, I think the place to start is by acknowledging that all of us are here, at least in part, as a result of others. We're all certainly the beneficiaries of our family's influences, but beyond that, my guess is that each of us has someone in our life who played the role of example, of role model, a mentor. We do stand on the shoulders of those who came before us. Today I want to introduce you to someone you may already know, someone who's played that role for me and for many others, a person whose influence on this institution, on this community, and on this state is vast and wide. Many of you already know him, but even those who don't probably feel his influence unknowingly. In 1994, I arrived in Salem as a college sophomore across the street at Willamette. I hadn't been smart enough to come here as a freshman, but I recognized that mistake and transferred. And I'd had the chance to work in campaigns and in politics and the legislature as I was growing up in Idaho, and knew that I wanted that experience here. So I started asking around the Capitol, and it wasn't long before I recognized the trend. People were talking about this candidate from South Salem who they were convinced would be a formidable legislator and an insightful mentor, and they were certainly right. I was really excited to have a chance to work with Bryan, and I didn't know it at the time, but it was a real transformational experience, just as it has been for many other people. Over the next 14 years, I had a chance to work with Bryan in a variety of different contexts, and campaigns in the legislature, when he was dean and president at Willamette, and despite all of those different contexts, I'm well aware of the fact that I saw only a small portion of the ways he contributed to the state and to the world. And even though those accomplishments and contributions are significant, it's not what I'll remember him most for or what I'll miss most. That I'll miss most is his style. He was a guy who took his work very seriously, but with large help from the amigos, managed to avoid taking himself too seriously. He was a valued colleague whose opinion was sought after, who was friend to people of all political stripes. I've met plenty of people who disagreed with Bryan, including notably and sometimes frequently members of his own staff, but it's very hard to find someone who disliked him or didn't respect him, and I think that's a standard to which we should all aspire. He was an unparalleled leader and teacher. The Johnston Alumni Club includes current legislators, lobbyists, staffers, business leaders, and members of just about every group you could mention. And I think his legacy remains in each of us, that if you're fighting, you're already losing, but that if you do have to fight, fight someone or something bigger than yourself. He was a kid at heart. Those who knew him well will always point to his wit and his ability to relate to people of all sorts. I remember reading someone describe his wit as something that would make you laugh for a minute and think for 10, and I think that's about right. He was uniquely capable of tempering any bad news with humor and kindness. Ask him how he was, and you could count on the answer. Those of you who know this can recite it with me. Chubby, bald, fun to be with. And because of that gregariousness, there really was no such thing as a stranger to Bryan. It was nearly impossible to have a continuous conversation with him out in public because people were always interrupting to say hello, or he was always interrupting to say hello to them. He liked to say that human relationships are like bank accounts. You can't make withdrawals before you make deposits, and that's another lesson I try to remember. But his greatest gift, I think, is clearly his commitment to family. The time I knew him, I can't think of a single time he missed a family obligation, whether it was Courtney's soccer games, Zach's debate tournaments, or any of the others. He was somehow able to integrate those responsibilities with his professional obligations. And I always enjoyed it when he would talk about an upcoming date with his girlfriend, and people would wince, since they didn't know, as we did, that this is how he referred to his wonderful wife, Anne, after decades of marriage. He also referred to her as the executive director, and she was clearly both. How he did it, how he managed to craft a successful professional career and a first-rate family is something I'm still trying to understand and emulate, but there's no question that his family meant more to him than anything. Professionally, Bryan served in a remarkable number of roles, and I'm tempted now to do my best impression of Obie in reading a long list, but there are a few worth mentioning. He was a lawyer, a public defender, a professional mediator, arbitrator, trainer, a law professor, founder and director of the Center for Dispute Resolution at Willamette's College of Law, associate dean of the College of Law, dean of the Atkinson Graduate School of Management at Willamette, interim president of Willamette, Oregon State Representative, interim executive director of the United Way of the Mid-Willamette Valley, interim director of the Oregon Department of Human Services, and interim director of the department's Division of Children and Families. I'm sure I would exhaust my remaining 4 minutes if I tried to list all of his board and volunteer service. All that service earned him plenty of honors, and he had a ready response when some of us would tease him about maybe he ought to grow up and get a real job. His eyes would twinkle, he'd look at us and say, some people just can't keep a job. But of course it wasn't that he couldn't keep a job, it was that there wasn't enough of him to go around. The Statesman Journal had a nice editorial and called him by, I think, an appropriate nickname when they called him Mr. Fix-It. In an editorial they said, quote, need someone to fill in as Willamette University president? Call on Bryan. Need someone to give a commencement address? Call on Bryan. Need someone to run a state agency? Call on Bryan. Need someone to lead a school bond measure campaign? Call on Bryan, and much, much more, end quote. It's probably a bit cliche, but he was a true Renaissance man. Lots of people know about his love of public service, philosophy, and politics, but fewer people, I think, know about his love for the arts. It was the arts that brought him to Oregon initially in the form of the Drum and Bugle Corps, and it was arts he chose as a subject when Willamette asked him to speak as part of a program called Last Lectures. I also remember him telling him that quoting Kierkegaard maybe wasn't the best idea at a town hall meeting, but that's who he was. One of those rare guys who can move from community service to comedy to Kierkegaard all in the space of a single sentence. St. Martin's University, who had just named him president, missed out on a great leader, and so too did Oregon miss out on much Bryan had yet to give. As we honor a man whose title so often included the word interim, perhaps it's wise for us to remember the interim nature of life itself. Here's a guy who used the time he had to do great things, offering once again a real model for us. In the end, I think the best we can do to honor Bryan is to live up to his standards. Remember what Governor McCall said, that heroes are not giant statues framed against a red sky. They're people who simply say, this is my community and it's my responsibility to make it better. Bryan was a hero, and as we remember him and his contributions, I hope you'll join me in thanking his family, many of whom are here today on the side aisle, his wife Anne, his son and my Chief of Staff Drew, his daughter and Senate Judiciary Committee Assistant Courtney, son Zach, son John, and nephew Robert Unger. I hope you'll join me in thanking them for sharing Bryan with us and with the state. I urge your aye vote. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Is there further discussion?